we're going to have Dr. Vincent Gaddis with us, and we're going to lay out some things about the past and the future of civil rights. So stay with us, listen with us, be with us here this afternoon. One thing before Dr. Gaddis, I'm going to bring up one thing. I want to bring up that I think a lot of people in the Aurora should honor is the way I don't. Oh, where did my picture go? Okay, here, Officer Brian Shields, who just passed away from COVID, and today at Harvest Baptist, Harvest New Beginnings in Oswego, they're having a wake for him tonight, and tomorrow a service for our fallen policeman, Officer Brian Shields. So I just wanted to bring that up a moment here. And maybe you knew Dr. Gaddis here. Welcome. And I'm just going to, we're going to pass the torch here a little more here. So I thank him for coming with us here this afternoon. And maybe you knew Officer Shields. I maybe met him once, so just by chance, maybe a month ago or so. But
I did not know Officer Shields personally. No.
Yeah. Well, I think I met him at the famous eatery on the east side, Jake's Bagels.
Right. No, but I am certainly past my condolences on to his family and APD, and unfortunately, as I've read in the paper, so I'm assuming that this has been verified that he died from complications from COVID-19.
That's what Denise Crosby put in the paper.
Which has been a disease that has impacted, obviously, first responders in a highly significant way, but also African Americans in a disproportionate way as well.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And yes, that's a very good point. The east side of Aurora has got low vaccination rate, under 50%. And yeah, we got to bring that up. And
absolutely.
On this Martin Luther King Day, we got to think about our others. And as Dr. King would think about the others that are being left out. We're going to talk about civil rights, past and future. And background of my screen here is a voting rights signing, and behind my body is Dr. King. I'm sorry, I'm covering him up, but he's over in the back of me. But you can see Johnson on the one side there on our left. Well, be my right, your left. Anyway, you can see Johnson there, and then we had the other. I think this is voting right. Then we had the civil rights, right? We had two bills, big bills. Is that right?
The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which established things like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which established not only significant laws about employment discrimination, but also gave us the framework for what we call affirmative action today. And then we had and it also had voting protections in it, but most specifically was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which in essence set the stage to allow African Americans to finally be treated as first-class citizens in this country with equal access to the ballot, which now is under fire in 2022.
That sounds. It's just. So that's the voting rights that was some section. I forgot the section part, but that got overturned. That the Justice Department was watching the southern states.
Section 3, I believe it's Section 3 of the Voting Rights Act in the Holder v. U.S. case, which wound up gutting federal oversight protections of voting rights standards, which allowed states to then erect their own voting rights legislation, which in the case of most of the states that have been doing this, has been legislation to actually restrict the vote.
Yeah, that sounds like going back from the Reconstruction, and there was things. Then they got pulled back, and then we have this, and now we have. Then there's another pullback. It seems like it goes back and forth. We're just not. We're maybe moving 2 steps forward and 1 1/3, 1.5 back, or something. Or it's just not moving ahead, maybe. And what's you want to give us a little more about? I had this article. I'll digress here about Martin Luther King Jr.'s hard words with white Christians. I'm going to post it on XPIN News. It was a religious news service article, just came out. But anyway, about white Christians, and Dr. King was in the this gentleman does quote that the Birmingham jails. And you want to give us a little background and a little more about Dr. King, and I would call it, I guess they would call it the white moderate or whatever.
Well, sure. Well, of course, the letter from the Birmingham jail, which he wrote in 1963 in the midst of really the major civil rights campaign up to that point, in the struggle, the struggle at Birmingham around the Easter of 1963, 8 white clergy from Birmingham wrote an op-ed in the New York Times. Well, Martin Luther King, of course, was in Birmingham at the time. The campaign had started. Many were, of course, this is a direct action campaign, and so tensions were very high. And these pastors and others wrote this editorial saying that, King is an outsider, he's an agitator, he's advocating violence, and therefore, he should just stop, and eventually African Americans will get their rights if they would just wait. And so King, after Project C began, which was where the children began being arrested, the NAACP was running out of funds, the SCLC was in trouble, and King really wasn't sure what to do at that phase of the struggle. To tell you the truth, things were beginning to bog down, and so he threw on his jacket one morning and said to his lieutenants, I don't know what I can do about raising money or getting people out of jail, but I do know I can go to jail with them. He led a demonstration and was arrested. They put him in solitary confinement. And for some reason, a guard gave him a copy of the New York Times to read. And he read this editorial. And for some reason after that, he asked the guard for a pencil, and they gave him a pencil. And around the margins of the New York Times, he wrote his response. And that response is what we know of as the letter from the Birmingham jail. And in that letter, one of the significant critiques that King makes is this critique against what he calls the white moderate. Now, when he mentions this, he mentions it really in 2 ways. Number one, white moderate, meaning whites in general who don't really, who say they believe in civil rights, but they are more interested in not having tension than they are in having civil rights. In other words, as King said it, they're more interested in a negative peace than a positive justice, right? And then he also mentions in that letter that he's very distraught with the white moderate in his disappointment with the church. That he believed that the church, and he's talking here again to white churchgoers, and he says, I'm very disappointed because he thought that those leaders would stand up for justice, would stand up for civil rights, but in fact they had not done so. Were more interested in law and order than they were interested in justice and equality. And so King was very distraught about this, and later in his life, in the next couple of years, of his life, he wrote and gave speeches where he accentuated this fact that he was, as he mentions in the letter from Birmingham jail, it's not the white citizens counselor, it's not the Ku Klux Klanner that angers him. We know where they stand. What angers him is the white person or the white church that says, well, we're for civil rights, but we're not for actually advocating for civil rights. We're for civil rights, but we're not for marching down the street and demanding things and creating what King called this creative tension around raising these issues.
Right.
And that critique is very salient today, because certainly we can see that in large measure, just as in 1961, a guy named Byron was the pastor of the largest white church in Montgomery, Alabama, 1961. He gives a sermon and he says that basically that he believes in separation of the races. It's God ordained, and therefore, if you have a problem with segregation, it's God's problem.
Okay.
And that position in significant ways is the same position that the white evangelical church today has taken, right?
Right.
Opposed to the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, opposed to the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, opposed to opposing these voter restrictions and so on. And that very position is one that historically can be traced back to the Southern Baptist Convention, can be traced back in time all the way to the founding of this country. In other words, when we look at the church and civil rights, there are really two sides of this. There are two oppositional things happening within the umbrella of what we call Christianity.
Yeah.
Let me say it this way. A.W. Tozer said, the most important thing that we ever think about is what we think about when we think about God.
Okay.
If what you think about God is that God is a white man who has placed white people as the his chosen ones, as the most intelligent, the only civilized ones, the ones that he has graced with higher innate abilities, etc., right? If that's your God, then what you create from that is an anthropology that says, okay, then the way I see man is that man is ordered on a hierarchy with whites at the top and then black, right? And then we bring in things like the curse of Ham. We bring in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5, slaves obey your masters. And we say, oh, well, see, they're the bringer of wood and the hewer of water. And so therefore slavery is a natural fact of scripture. And because we have the curse of Ham, therefore black people are cursed by God. So our anthropology is informed by a theology that says that Africans are less than, right? Less than human. And anthropology informs our sociology, how we organize the society. And so, of course, if your anthropology is that blacks have been burnt by the sun, they're cursed by God, others believed that Africans had mated with apes, and that explained the difference in their color and tone and features and everything else, then they're not really human.
Yeah.
And if they're not really human, you can enslave them. And if they're not really human, then it is okay to organize a society to justify an economic situation of slavery, right? An economic system of slavery by enslaving these people, because our anthropology says that they're not fully human, and therefore that reinforces our theology that says that God is a white man with a beard. Right? Go to the Sistine Chapel, which informs our psychology, which then the normative psychology is to accept this position, and what would be seen as a aberrant psychology would be to do things like say, Black Lives Matter.
Yeah. Systematic
racism exists. White supremacy is wrong, and agitating for those things that Dr. King agitated for, right? That is in brief, a theological string that runs through the white evangelical church.
Yeah.
Writ large, right? Let me just finish.
Okay, sure.
On the other side of that, now, is this. What if your theology is that God is a God of love, that God is a God that loves all of his creation equally, who sent his son to die for all of creation equally?
Right.
That believes in a Bible, Genesis 1:26-28, when it says, give man dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over every creeping thing. You'll notice it does not say, and let some men have dominion over other men. So if that's your theology, then the way your anthropology works is to dignify the worth of human personality, to say that every single human being should be treated with respect and dignity, that in fact the goal of man is to create a society that lifts every voice, which would be a sociology that says that we must eliminate what King called the triple evils of our society: racism, poverty, and militarism. That we would create a society where we eliminate poverty, eliminate health disparities, where there would be no disparities, which informs a psychology that then says that then what is normative is beloved community and love, and what is crazy is to say, well, racism doesn't exist. I don't believe it. That institutional racism isn't real. That there is no inequality, right? That would be crazy. And these two things, right, if you look at the divide in America, you can run that divide right down the center of Christianity as well. Because we're just talking white evangelical America that has gone towards the extreme right, gone towards Christian nationalism. And I don't mean every white evangelical is an evil person or anything. I'm not saying that. I'm saying the institutional structure called the white evangelical church was opposed to civil rights in the 60s, was pro-slavery in the 19th century, and the 18th century has its roots in Cotton Mather and all those guys back in the 15th and 16th centuries, and that strain of thinking is prevalent today. There were people at January 6th in Washington, D.C., in the midst of an insurrection with crosses saying that Jesus condoned the insurrection.
Yeah.
That's one
Confederate flags there too and things.
These are people who claim to be Christians.
Right.
And then on the other side, you've got William Barber. You've got the United Methodist Church. You've got most of the institutional black church that is fighting for voting rights, fighting for civil rights, fighting for economic, social, and political justice.
Yeah.
Right?
This article has some excerpts from Dr. King from the Birmingham jail, and one is, I think I've heard this many times from evangelicals, and this, I think you might have more history on this, but the evangelical church was not always against social action. We know, like, Wheaton College was founded by an abolitionist. We know that there's other movements in the late 1800s that were by Chris. Oh, we can go down the list of women's temperance, women's right to vote. Most of all those were led by Christian women and leaders. And then all of a sudden, it got changed, that we don't believe in social action anymore. And Dr. King quotes, he says, I've heard many ministers, he says, those are social issues which the gospel has no real concern. I've heard that before, that we just separate these things. And I think you were alluding to that too, right? We separate social and gospel.
Right. And well, the idea being that the only thing we need to be concerned about, once again, is if all you think that the spiritual condition and reality of the Christian life is simply about you and God, and that's it, and not how you function within society, well, that's problematic, because we live in a culture. We're bringing the gospel to a culture. And when we bring a gospel to a culture, we're going to find in that culture injustices.
Right. He had in this article,
are we going to do something about the injustices? And to say that the gospel doesn't say anything about inequality or social justice, then I would challenge you to go back and look at the story of the Good Samaritan and tell me how that is not about social justice.
Okay.
Go back and look at the Sermon on the Mount.
Right.
How is that not about social justice? Read Matthew 25. Right. Especially 24 through 36. And tell me how that's not about social justice. Right. Jesus was concerned with not only the spiritual health of the people, but their material and physical and social life of individuals, right? Otherwise, he wouldn't have wasted his breath on saying, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit those in prison, heal the broken heart. I'm mixing Luke 4 in there too. Heal the brokenhearted. He would have said nothing about those things, but he did. So that must be important. And yet there's a whole element of Christianity that believes that those issues are not issues for the church, and it's just plain wrong.
Well, I was just thinking about this today. If Jesus was more on this individualistic approach to God and not in the community, I don't know why Pilate would have really had too much concern about him. And I think when we realize that's why the church is a danger to the world, because it speaks to those issues. If you're going to have this individualized kind of Christianity, most dictators and other leaders, that wouldn't be a threat to them. But
Exactly.
when you have this that's showing that everybody is, we're all in Christ. I mean, this tribalism and all that is gone. We're all in one. That's what they don't want to hear. And Hitler was an example of he wanted just one type, and it really broke Bonhoeffer and got Bonhoeffer when they started to persecute Jews more. He really realized this church is not speaking out. And
yeah, well, and the same thing has happened here in a little bit of a nuanced way, that we have to really that we have to take on, right? Because within the dynamic of this understanding is really a kind of a worldview, right? Emerson and Smith, and I know this book is a little dated, but the work in it is so great, called Divided by Faith, White Evangelicals and the Problem of Race in America. And in the book, they stake out this argument that I think is really important, that white evangelicals overwhelmingly see the world in terms of what they call individual free will accountability. In other words, you're poor because you made poor choices. You're a drug addict because you chose to do drugs. You know, everything is about individual choice, like as though it's separated from the other part of worldview, which is social constructs, institutional forms, right? So I had a conversation at one time with someone who I respect, who is a white evangelical, who believes that racism can only be viewed as the acts of individuals, that there is no institutional framework in which racism exists. Yet people of color and allies and others can see that there are social structures, and those structures limit or can limit choices, and that choices happen within that structure. And so you've got to change the structure to open more choice. But the most white evangelicals don't see that. And so, therefore, something like Black Lives Matter and mass protests and demonstrations, calling out white supremacy, calling out the institutional racism that exists, you know, in King's time, asking, you know, marching against segregation. Their attitude is that, you know, these are individual things, and if you just will convert every human heart individually to, you know, change, then racism won't exist anymore. Which, of course, King's retort to all of that is that the oppressor never willingly gives up their advantage. It must be won by the oppressed, right?
Yeah, that got King and Reverend Graham, Billy Graham, probably somewhat on opposite views there. Somewhat, I know they had some friendship, but some of that, what you just talked about, Graham was put in positions where he could have done. He did some, but he could have done a lot more with on integration and everything. I guess being part of the South, I guess that was part of him too.
Well, and I'm not an expert on Billy Graham. I would like to give the benefit of the doubt to him, that he recognized all of these issues, yet may not have formulated a way to deal with them directly. I don't know.
I know they
Um,
had some friendship though, but yeah,
yeah, but at some point, but the reality is how do we understand a Christianity that isn't out in the streets arguing for justice when we clearly see injustice happening all around us? Right, and that is, I think, what King saw as so baffling. Is here's a system of segregation. It's immoral. There's no way you can argue that it is moral. It is against God's law. It is not the way God would have us to live, and yet there's a whole institutional structure called the white evangelical church that backed segregation, that was not an ally in the struggle for civil rights in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, in the 2000s, or now.
yeah. You
And
know,
that's just something we have to deal with, right?
in the '60s, I was a young guy. We all were younger. And my parents wanted to do something different. We had left this one church and we said, well, we'll have a Bible study and have others come. And we brought in this outside teacher from Moody Bible. And it was going well. But then I think one or two times she brought in some John Birch stuff. This was in the 60s. I say 66 maybe. She brought in some John Birch stuff, and then she brought in a tape of Dr. King from Hoover, I think. And this was supposed to be the smoking gun, that he was a communist or something. And I remember my mother, and I think my dad didn't go because he was working then, but my mother did. And I think right after that, we just said, that's it. We're not doing this Bible study anymore. This is not right. But then, it didn't smell right. It wasn't right. So we stopped that. And I remember that period. It seems like it's similar to right now in a lot of ways. It's the same approach somewhat.
Sure. Well, when you have look at the response of and again, I'm not saying every single white Christian is some kind of evil racist. I'm saying white Christianity, white evangelical Christianity has been not a proponent of economic, social, or political justice, right? Look at this whole argument, which I think is just foolishness that I hear most of the time, of we don't want critical race theory taught in school. First of all, most people who are opposed to critical race theory don't even know what it is. Number one, they don't know the difference between that and cultural responsive teaching. Number two.
Right.
And number three, what is the opposition to that have to do anything to do with Christianity, period? Right? But it's an example of we don't want the history,
right,
of Black people or people of color more broadly,
right,
taught, because it is a threat to history or white history. You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And for those individuals, this goes to the core of their theology, that God is white, which informs their anthropology, which means if we allow for the true telling of American history that says, the highest decorated unit in World War I were black soldiers from Harlem. Well, they don't want to hear about that because the only heroes World War II were white soldiers, right? That's what we see all the time. When in fact the 369th Infantry was the most highly decorated unit in World War I. The most highly decorated American combat unit in World War II, the 442nd Infantry Regiment, were Japanese Americans who volunteered to fight for the United States to prove their loyalty so that their families could be released from internment camps on the West Coast.
Okay.
Now, why is this a problem to teach in school? Why is slavery a problem to teach in school?
Well, then they won't teach about the Jonathan Blanchards either, will they?
There you go. So,
what we should be teaching is the Jonathan Blanchards and the anti-abolitionists. That's the counter to what you're saying, but then we're not getting that even probably. I don't know how they're going to do that.
Of course, and I don't necessarily know if this is where you wanted the show to go, but that's fine. We're here now. Which is the other issue is this. I find it very curious of this whole hostility to teaching these aspects of African American history, because all along the line in all of those stories were white allies who were part of making these things happen.
Right.
But of course we can't talk, if you don't want to talk about the 369th Infantry, well, then we can't talk about General Pershing either. Right. If you don't want to talk about, if you don't want to talk about the Tuskegee Airmen, then let's not talk about Eleanor Roosevelt either. It's right. Unfortunately, and it's not only just white evangelical Christians now, I'm saying Americans writ large. Right. We don't like nuance, right? We want to put everything in a box, and that's the way it is. But to return to the original thing that we're talking about of civil rights, we really need to decide what kind of future do Christians want in this country? Because one vision of a future with significant Christian influence would be to restore voting rights, to fight for economic and social justice, right? In my mind, would be pictures of John Lewis, Father Flagler, Martin Luther King, Benjamin Barber, or is the Christianity that we want, the American future of Christianity we want, typified by a picture of crosses at the January 6th insurrection, of a painting of Jesus with a MAGA hat on, of the legacy of Jerry Falwell, and the opposition to economic, social, and political justice? Which version of Christianity will prevail in this country? White Christian nationalism, or a Christianity that is more in line with the revolutionary Jesus that we say we believe in, who was a revolutionary for love, and love in public is justice?
You brought up about revolutionary, and in that Birmingham jail, this is an excerpt from this article. Mm-hmm. He says, here's what King said. He said, Christians, he's talking about Christians through history, early history, that they really were revolutionary. He's bringing that point up. But he says Christians pressed on in conviction that they were a colony of heaven called to obey God rather than man. And that's what he was trying to call the church back to be a colony of heaven. This beloved community, is that a King statement about that, or is that where that came from?
Mm-hmm.
So it's the same idea. Colony of heaven would be the same thought, I suppose.
Yes, the same idea that we are called to bring the love and justice of God to heaven, right? Let water run down like a mighty stream and righteousness like a river, right? This is who we're called to be. What we are called to be are those who challenge man's systems,
right,
by saying, here is what love looks like. And there is nowhere where love looks like racial oppression. That's not love. Restricting voting, that doesn't look like love. Being opposed to the idea that Black lives matter. And I heard something very interesting about that today, which I think I would agree with this, that we should think of it like this: Black Lives Matter too, TOO.
Right.
Right? Black Lives Matter too.
Right.
Right? And
yeah,
so
I think that's a good way to look at it, because some of these other people have just made that like that's it, and like you're neglecting me,
right. Well,
everybody.
Right. Well, the problem is that for those in opposition to BLM, argue, well, all lives matter. Yeah, we know that.
Right.
But if all lives matter, then Black lives matter too.
Right.
Right.
That's right.
And so we need to acknowledge that, right? And we need to acknowledge, right? I mean, think of it this way, John, and we can talk about civil rights in the future in this way as well. Do you believe that America? Well, let me say it this way: how do we deal with when one commits a harm against us,
mm-hmm.
or a sin against his neighbor?
Right.
We must recognize it. How well do you think America is doing with recognizing the sin of racism and acknowledging its reality? Not that great.
No.
But if you want to deal with it, you have to recognize it, but after that comes recompense. If you do wrong to me, if you steal from me, you must restore what you have stolen.
Mm-hmm.
Then comes repentance and the changing of the mind and the heart. And then comes reconciliation. Well, we can't even get the recognition part down. We have a whole segment of the Christian, of Christendom that can't or won't give recognition to the reality of systemic racism and the pernicious effects of it over time, and the implication, and deal with that implication within the Christian movement. Well, if we can't recognize it, how are we ever going to get through the other three steps?
Yeah. Here's an interesting thing from 60 years ago about from the Birmingham jail. Let's hold it. That would be 60. My math has just failed me here. 50 some year, 55 years or whatever. But the Texas Senate, this article has this too. The Texas Senate passed in the summer to remove both "I Have a Dream" and a letter from the Birmingham jail from required reading lists in Texas schools.
Of course.
That's a flip. I mean, this is where we're at. This is not. This is back to the 60s almost. Maybe we made a few steps forward, but it doesn't. And then we got this voting thing that's not looking too good. Those two senators are holding out on basically status quo thinking instead of moving ahead and saying they're for it, but they're more for status quo.
Well, the end result of that is a situation wherein I believe there have been, 400 voter restriction bills
like right.
in 49 states have been introduced, but I believe there are 19 states where significant voter suppression efforts are underway or have passed in the legislature, including in states like Georgia, and I believe they haven't done it in Arizona, but in Georgia already, where the state legislature can take the popular vote and decide we don't like that outcome, and therefore we're not going to abide by it. And right now in Arizona and other states, you have people who are believing the big lie, who are running for state's attorneys and other positions where they can then decide if they don't like the outcome of an election to overturn that election. I mean, we're headed for some dark times. Democracy, American representative, constitutional republic with democratic leanings, which is what we live in, the greatest experiment in freedom in the history of this planet, is teetering on the brink of fascism.
And that's a word we don't want to hear too much. Or we don't hear it too much. Fascism, right?
Right. Well, and here's the thing: when you wrap your flag around my cross, that's where we're headed, and that's exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
This idea that this idea that God is for the Proud Boys and the 3%ers, and and this attempted coup that happened on January 6th. I mean, it's a very scary thing, and I don't know how it's going to end, but civil rights in the future must begin with the passage of the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill. I just don't, and if it doesn't pass in 22 and especially in 24, we could be hurled into a major constitutional crisis, because those who Donald Trump has taken over the Republican Party. We need to just acknowledge that. And what he did as president, and this is important, was really erode democratic small d norms, the peaceful transition of power from one leader to another, all kinds of other norms of decorum and so on that the president does. And so as those norms have eroded, along with states that are actively engaged in curtailing the civil rights of significant portions of their population, we're headed down a very dark path. A very dark path. I mean, one could ask themselves. I heard the Doris Kearns Goodwin, Michael, and not Beschloss, but someone else talking about this. Is this 1968 that we're living through right now?
Yeah.
Or 1858 that we're living through right now?
Even further back, yeah.
Because if we're living through 1968, we're living through a significant social upheaval.
Right.
But that questioned the state, but was not engaged in activity or engaged in a way of moving the country towards civil war. 1858, we were engaged in the kind of social uproar that was moving the country towards civil war because there was a segment of the society that was not willing to address or believe that they were being threatened by the removal of slavery, right? And today there's a significant portion of white society, and this is all bound up within this whole Christian thing, right? Who believe that the demographic pressures of the growth of black and brown people in this country, the erosion of the white majority, they're afraid. Yeah. And the end goal that they seek may or may not be civil war, but it certainly is apartheid.
Right. They want to keep power, however they're going to do that, I don't know.
Exactly. And how they do that nonviolently is impossible. And so I'm very worried about civil rights going forward, but I do hold out hope that God can speak into the hearts of those who have been opposed to civil rights, opposed to Black Lives Matter, opposed to social justice, social, economic, political, and racial justice, and that God can speak to them. I have to believe that.
Yeah, let's close out with, I'm going to bring up one statistic that this article also brings out, that the white evangelical age has gone up from, right now, the national average for the median age is 44. The white evangelical is 57, so they're losing young people. And I think King would have been on that too, about how they're doing that. So that's anyway, they're in trouble that way with the younger people, and I agree with that totally. I've seen that. So I want you to give me a thought. Here's my thought. Well, let's close out maybe with this. My thought in the back of my mind is the only one that's going to speak to us in a contemporary and spiritual way. I don't know if there's another Dr. King, maybe Mr. Reverend Barber's one, but maybe there's someone else. But I think it's going to be from the Black church or the Latino church. Some leader has got to come up and really put the stamp on this and move us ahead. Otherwise, I just don't know where we're going. We got to have some leadership to push us in that right direction. I don't want to put all on one person, but it seems like we need a prophet, maybe.
Well, I certainly believe that Benjamin Barber is a great leader for justice in our time.
Yeah.
So is Father Flager.
Right.
There are others out there who are, but there are people like Michael Eric Dyson, in the intellectual field. Cornel West in the intellectual field.
Right.
but I don't know if we may have moved past that time where a singular voice
Okay.
is able to move us forward. And so there has to be a kind of collective participation.
Right.
And I'm hoping that those voices will coalesce and continue to be raised. That right, Stacey Abrams may be that person
Right.
in this moment. But before we go, I would love to recommend to your viewers that they read a book by a man named Jones called White Too Long, White Evangelicals, and I forgot the subtitle, but it's called
Maybe this is
White
the
Too
guy I'm
Long.
quoting here for you. His name is Robert Jones.
Yes.
The legacy, maybe White Too Long, the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity.
Yes,
I think it's the name of the book.
I highly recommend that text. Another one that I also would recommend right now is, and I forgot the author, slipped my mind right just now, but it's called The Color of Christ.
Really?
I would definitely read that book. And then I would also encourage your viewers to go get Ibram X. Kendi and his book Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, because this explains in beautiful detail the roots of this theology that I was talking about earlier today. And then lastly would be Emerson and Smith, um, um, uh, Divided by Faith, White Evangelicals and the Problem of Race in America, something like that. I think these are really important books that we need to get our head around. And then there are, of course, a whole series of books by James Cone and others that we really should engage in. And you know, part of that recognition would be for white or, you know, all Christians, but let's just, since institutionally we're talking about white evangelicals being opposed to civil rights, go read these books.
Right.
And really question, you know, where do we go from here? Because the choices are becoming, are we headed towards authoritarianism or a renewal of American democratic possibilities? Small d. And that is like what King said when he founded the SCLC in their founding documents. This is a fight to save the soul of the nation.
Right. Well, we're going to have more Dr. Gaddis. This has got an extensive time here, so we'll pass this around this video, and we'll learn more with thoughts from Dr. Gaddis here. And I just thank Dr. Gaddis for being with us today and sharing his thoughts about civil rights. And we did basically maybe that was the way it was going to go, off drifted to white evangelicals and civil rights, but they go together. And I think that was very important. But as we said, we're going to have engagement and prayer to really move ahead here in America. And I again thank Dr. Gaddis. Wednesday, I'm working on a guest. We don't have that guest, but I got a couple in the, as they say, the tank or whatever we're working on. So
well, thank you very much for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Again, I thank Dr. Vincent Gaddis for being with us today. And we'll see you soon again, everybody. And tell your friends about this tape, this video, this time together. We're going to spread it around. So anyway, so God bless you out there. And thank you for coming by and visiting with us. Thank you again, Dr. Vincent Gaddis of her history professor at Elgin Community College. Thank you very much, Dr. Gaddis.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now. God bless, and bye-bye, everybody.